All right, so that brings us into week 15. Question 3, how did the Soviet Union act immediately after World War II and why? How did the capitalist liberal democracies, the CLDs, respond, particularly seeing the policies containment and the Marshall Plan? So one thing we have to emphasize is, and this is something I apologize I missed in the week 14 questions, was what was the human cost of the war? So, there was a lot of bad things that happened in World War II. 2/3 of European Jews are killed. Other groups were targeted for extermination and genocide. There was a lot of enslavement, forced laborers, including the so-called comfort women, who were women mostly in Asia, but including a few Western women as well, who were forced by the Japanese to basically be kind of like military prostitutes. And this was not voluntary at all. This was forced. So it's basically kind of systematic forced rape. It's really terrible. And the total dead was around 75 million people. Not to mention, of course, the moral costs, right? A lot of people did a lot of bad things. But notice, okay, it's 75 million people. Notice the Soviet Union accounted for 20 million of those people, as did China, right? And I don't mean together, I mean separately. So 40 million Chinese, or a total of 40 million citizens of the Soviet Union and Chinese died. So the Soviet Union lost, like I said, 20 million people. So because of their massive losses in World War II, they needed to their desire was to maintain their own security and make the world safe for communism. And the answer, and those two things from their perspective went together, right? If the Soviet Union is safe because the Soviet Union is communist, that's good for communism. So they want to extend communism. So they annexed territory to the Soviet Union. They took a bunch of territory here, and then they forced the governments here to accept communist governments, right? They established governments in places like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, some of which had been democracies beforehand. This is not what the majority of people in those countries wanted. The Soviet Union said, too bad, you're communist now. You don't have a choice. And this was a large part because of their own security fears. And so we can kind of understand this, though, again, it's problematic to invade and take over someone else's country and then try and call that self-defense. But that's what the Soviet Union was doing. The capitalist liberal democracies were threatened by this, both in terms of their security, but also their ideals. But here's the thing. They didn't want another world war. So they can't invade, right? If the United States was to say, hey, look, we're mad about you taking over this territory. We want these people to be free. The Soviet Union would say, well, what are you going to do about it? Well, the only thing we could do would be to invade, which would immediately start war with the Soviet Union, right? So we don't want that. So we can't invade another, because that would start another war, but we also can't just tell the Soviet Union, hey, it's cool, it's fine for you to go ahead and do this, because that's what basically had happened with Hitler, right? Adolf Hitler could have been stopped early if people would have stood up to him. We talked about previously in the lessons why people didn't, but the fact was that if it was felt that if we just let the Soviet Union do this, they would continue to spread. And so the idea was like, okay, we can't stop the Soviet Union where it already is, but we can try and prevent its spread, right? We can't invade, that'll start a war, but we can't appease because that would probably just lead to a war anyway. So we need to prevent spread. And I want to stress, the communists were trying to expand. There's a civil war in Greece over communism, right? This is in Greece. And especially if you're a believer in democracy, the idea of the cradle of Western democracy going communist is really disturbing. And also the Soviet Union was trying to spread its power into Turkey. So there's this idea, okay, we can't stop them where they already are. That will lead to war. We can't also appease them because that will let them get strong and then lead to war. But we can try and stop their spread. And that's why Harry Truman is going to develop this policy of containment, which is basically preventing the further spread of communism while generally avoid pushing back where it already exists. So in 1947, the U.S. President Harry Truman promised financial military aid to those countries facing communist threats like Greece and Turkey. And in 1948, under the Marshall Plan, the United States dedicated a lot of money to help rebuild Europe. We gave European countries money, or we gave them loans. And on one side, this was, the idea was to help fight communism, to also help people. And the idea is that, if capitalism brings prosperity broadly, then people will support it. And if capitalism fails to do this, then people might try communism, right? So let's help the European countries get wealthy, be wealthy democracies, and then people won't be attracted to communism. Of course, also, we're loaning them money and we're giving them some money. We expect them to spend the money on American products, so it will also help us too. So that's kind of there's mixed reasons for going into things, both practical and idealistic. What was MAD? Why is it important? So basically, no countries possessing nuclear weapons have ever fought each other in a war. Every war since World War II has been between countries that either neither has nuclear weapons or one does and the other doesn't. No countries ever possessing nuclear weapons have ever fought each other in war. And basically what would happen, the reason is that eventually one of them would use nuclear weapons against the other. And this would result in what's called MAD, mutually assured destruction. Right? So if the United States were to actually go to war with the Soviet Union, one of us would start losing, and whichever country started losing would probably use its nuclear weapons, and then the other side would use its nuclear weapons, and no one wins a nuclear war. I mean, it's like, I guess technically you win because, the other side may be defeated, but the cost is so high, right? It's like, yes, we won the war against the Soviet Union, but, New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Boston, they're all gone, right? You can't call that a victory. And that's why countries today want to join the nuclear club, and that's why I would argue North Korea will never give up its nuclear weapons voluntarily. Now, what this means then is that the United States and the Soviet Union will never fight each other directly, but we would, and so we'll have a Cold War in Europe and North America, but other regions would face what we call proxy wars, where one side would secretly or openly back the other, and then the other side would secretly back the other side. So, for example, in the Vietnam War, the United States will actively help the South Vietnamese, whereas China and the Soviet Union will more or less secretly help the North Vietnamese, but we won't fight each other directly. This will also happen in places like Korea and Afghanistan as well. What were the characteristics of decolonization? So World War II had been fought in part against Axis aggression. It's like, hey, the Germans, the Japanese are trying to go and take over other people's countries. And we need to stop them and we need to liberate those countries. And a lot of countries, especially those that had been colonies of like the British and the French, said, yeah, that's great. You want to liberate the countries invaded by Germany and Japan. Why don't you liberate us too? You're colonies, right? Algeria had been French, under French control. This map's focusing on Africa, but, Indonesia had been Dutch. Malaysia had been British. India had been British. They were supposedly fighting for liberation against the Nazis. Well, why not liberate us, your colonies? And so what happens is the colonial independence movements in places like Algeria and India became stronger during the war, and Britain and France had been weakened by World War II. I mean, remember, France had been completely conquered, and they found it difficult to try and fight these colonial independence movements. So increasingly they will end formal control, but will still seek to maintain informal influence, what we would call neocolonialism. So, you may pull out of the country, but you might try and negotiate treaties that would give you some control over that country's economy or something like that. It's kind of what the United States had done in the Philippines. So, increasingly, these colonial countries will become independent, formally, politically, but the foreign countries will maintain informal influence, what we call neocolonialism. And the colonial countries will often lack a modern economic base and educated population, so it's hard for them to avoid continued domination. So they might get political independence, but they'll still be dependent on foreign countries because they don't have a good economic base and they don't have the education system necessary. So they will be politically independent, but they're in a weakened position, and that allows for what we call neocolonialism, where you have influence over a foreign country without directly controlling it. What was the Suez Crisis? What does it tell us about how countries like Egypt could take advantage of the Cold War to pursue their own interests? So in Egypt, you had this interesting guy, Gamal Nasser, take control. And Egypt, during this period, what could have theoretically been a victim of neocolonialism. It does not have a very modern economy. Its population has some education, but it's nowhere similar to a European country. And what Gamal Nasser does is he doesn't try and be like the capitalist liberal democracies, and he doesn't try and be like the communists. He tries to develop an alternate path to modernity, what he would call Arab nationalism. So it's not communism, but he also follows socialism, but it's not communist socialism. So he's going to try and make his own way. And the idea is if he leans too much to one side, if he goes too much towards the Americans, then he'll become dependent on the Americans. They can kind of tell him what to do. If he leans too hard to the communist side, he'll become dependent on them. They can tell him what to do. He doesn't want to do either. So he tries to find a middle course. So he's going to try and maintain his independence by playing the major powers off of each other. Hey, the United States, the Soviet Union is going to give me this. What will you give me? All right, kind of like that. And you can see an example of how he plays this situation, the Suez Crisis of 1956. So the Suez is a canal, cuts across Egypt, and it allows European countries access to India and to Asia much, much more quickly, right? If London wants to go to Mumbai, it's only 7,200 miles if you go through the Suez Canal, pictured there, right? It's basically just a man-made river. But if you want to go all the way there around Africa, it takes 12,300 miles. So access to the canal is really important. It was owned by the British and the French, though, and that really bothered this is what I mean about kind of neo-colonialism. This is a very important piece of infrastructure, makes a lot of money, and it's in Egypt, but it's not owned by the Egyptians. It's owned by the British and the French. And so through it, the British and French could exert economic control, right? They could dominate this very important part of the Egyptian infrastructure and use it for their own advantage, not for the Egyptian advantage. So Gamal Nasser nationalized it. He wanted the money made from the Suez Canal to help him develop what's called the Aswan Dam. And the idea was that he could develop this dam along the Nile that would help give Egypt increased electrical power. So that's the idea, right? He wants the Suez Canal under his control because it's Egyptian, it's in Egypt, and then he can use it to help develop his country. However, it is French and British property, so Britain, France, and Israel all invade. And what happens is, even though the Egyptians can't defeat Britain, France, and Israel, their armies, the U.S. and the Soviet Union both work together to press Britain and France to back down. So Nasser gets to keep the canal. Right? So Nasser, even though he's not strong militarily enough to take and hold the canal, he's able, because he knows that the U.S. and the Soviet Union both want his support. They're willing to help him against his enemy. But notice, because he gets both of them to help him, neither one gets the advantage. They're both still kind of balanced. So this allows him to balance the U.S. and Soviet Union against each other while still getting the canal back. So this, even though there's this kind of neo-colonial situation, Gamal Nasser plays this game really well. What was the Green Book? What does it tell us about problems in the United States? So this is the Green Book. And it says, it says the Negro Traveler's Green Book, kind of old-fashioned way to refer to African Americans. And it says the Guide for Travel and Vacations, 20 Years for Service to the Negro Traveler. And it's like, okay, that's, all right, that exists. It kind of makes sense. Different communities in the United States have different needs. They have different characteristics. It makes sense that you would maybe want your own book that would guide you with that. But there's something a little bit more concerning here if we look into this, right? So you've got this nice picture of this African-American woman enjoying her trip, but then notice it says, assured protection for the Negro traveler. Okay, that's interesting, right? What does that mean? Well, the problem was during this time period, segregation was legal. And you're an African-American person who's traveling, you don't know, if you're trying to take a road trip, what town it's safe for you to stop in. You don't know what hotel you can go into. And imagine you've been driving all day, you pull into a hotel, and you're told, oh, we don't allow your kind, someone could be very insulting, we don't allow your kind to stay here. And then you got to go to another hotel, happens again, you go to another hotel, happens again. It's like midnight now. And some of these, could not only be insulting, this could be physically dangerous for you. And sometimes African-American travelers were just forced to pull off to the side of the road and just sleep in their cars. So this points to the serious racism you have in the United States. This is a time in the 50s when we're developing an interstate system, when more and more Americans are able to afford cars and to go on road trips. And that's kind of the great American dream, in a sense, go on a road trip. And road trips are cool because you're free, right? You drive and you can stop when you want, you go where you want. But that's something that's not allowed to African Americans, right? So if you're an African American, you have to get a special book that will just tell you how to do simple things like where it's safe for you to get something to eat. So that points to the racism in society. And I want to highlight that because a lot of times when we think about racism, we think of very, very obvious incidents. But this is just a basic thing, right? This is something that you really affects your daily life in deep ways. So it tells us about the racism in the United States. So what was Martin Luther King's plan to help bring civil rights? What role did nonviolent civil disobedience play? What technology helped win popular support? Why were people who were not African Americans more willing to support civil rights? What does it tell us about democracy? What economic changes did it lead to? So basically, you can see a lot of what's going on here by looking at this picture, I think. So this is an example of a protest. It was I think it was in Tennessee. I'm trying to remember exactly where it was, but there was a protest by sanitation workers, by garbage men, basically. They were being paid very poorly. There was a lot of racial issues they had to deal with, and so they went on strike. And there they are on strike. And you can see they're well dressed. They are not doing anything wrong. They're just walking. And it's interesting that they're wearing these posters that just assert that they're human beings. I am a man, right? I'm a human being. But look at how people are reacting. Not only are soldiers being brought out here, they have bayonets fixed to their rifles and they're pointing them at the sanitation workers. And oh my gosh, you have armored personnel carriers behind them. Are these guys that dangerous that you got to bring out the guard with bayonets and armored personnel things, right? So this is nonviolent civil disobedience, right? These people are protesting and they reveal the violence that maintains a racist system, right? They're protesting against racism. They're threatening the racist system, and look at how the racist system deploys violence to try and threaten them. These abuses were often televised, right? We have a new technology. Remember that video, how TV comes to Fort Wayne, Indiana. So Americans, instead of just reading like a news report about something, could see it. And they would see images like this, or they would see images of, you've probably seen famous footage of African Americans protesting, being sprayed with fire hoses or being attacked by dogs. Now that's being televised. So you can see it. This cannot be kept hidden. You can see it. And so these abuses are being televised, and you're an American that's not African American, you're white or you're Latino or wherever, and you look at this and you say, wow, this is really wrong. These African Americans, they're human beings, they're people, they have human dignity. It's not right to do this. They're our fellow Americans. And I think it's fascinating because you see a white guy here. And he's not a garbage man, I don't think. He looks like an office worker who just said, you know what, I'm going to go out and help these guys. He doesn't even have a sign, right? So I get the sense that he joined spontaneously. And so the key thing is here is by having this tactic where African Americans emphasize being civilly disobedient, right? They're being actively, this isn't being passive, they're being active, taking action that reveals this racist system, and that's all televised, and that gets other Americans to say, look, this is wrong, this shouldn't be done. So other Americans are going to begin supporting the civil rights movement. And they vote. And democracy allows change. And allows change to happen peacefully. The civil rights struggles weren't always peaceful, but it didn't lead to rebellion. It didn't lead to terrorism on a mass scale or anything like that. It could have theoretically, but it didn't, because democracy allowed for peaceful change when facing a really serious broken system. And the changes that democracy allowed, it led to more political rights for African Americans, which allowed them to rise in the economy, right? These guys, by protesting, by helping to get rid of racial laws and laws and segregation, which force African Americans to have bad education, poor education, and things like that, they removed those limits on African American people, and that allows them more economic opportunity and the rise of a black middle class. Where was capitalist liberal democracy exported? What was the significance of the divided countries? How well did capitalist liberal democracy work in these areas? So, for example, capitalist liberal democracy was exported to Japan. Japan became a functioning liberal democracy. From 1950 to 1973, its GNP expanded at an average rate of more than 10%. In early 1960, a Japanese prime minister promised the Japanese that he would double their income in 10 years, and he did it in like 7 years. So that by 1973, Japan was the third largest economy after the United States and Soviet Union, and was a fully functioning democracy. So this looks awesome, right? Japan, completely devastated by war, by 1973, third largest economy. That certainly makes capital liberal democracy look great. And you could compare, and you did this in some of the videos, West Germany, which was capital liberal democracy, was much more wealthy and free than communist East Germany. And by the 1980s, South Korea, which was capitalist, it wasn't yet a liberal democracy, but was becoming a democracy, was much more wealthy than North Korea. So capitalist liberal democracy is working much better than communism in terms of bringing people both freedom and economic development. Didn't have any questions here. Didn't have any questions here. Okay, we had this question. How did Gorbachev's reforms help lead to the fall of the Soviet Union instead of saving it? So Gorbachev was head of the Soviet Union in the late 80s, and he's going to engage in political and economic reform at the same time. And this leads the system just to fall apart, because why try and save communism? There's another model that works really well. We just saw it here in places like Japan and Germany and Korea. Why try and save communism? Let's just reform it. Or I'm sorry, let's just get rid of it and become like the West. Right? So Gorbachev tried to engage in these massive reforms. He admitted, hey, there's a problem with communism, but we'll fix it. And people are like, well, why fix communism? Capitalist liberal democracy is just much better. And it's striking that between 1989 and 1991, all Eastern European communist countries, all the republics that make up the Soviet Union are going to become independent. None of them will remain communist. Not a single country will choose to remain communist because capitalist liberal democracy just looks so much better. Now, that's there. China is going to go a very different direction. And the last few questions are basically about China. So we had this question, who won the Chinese Civil War between the nationalists and the communists? Why did that side win? What happened to the nationalists in the territory that they governed, Taiwan? So there's a civil war between the communists and nationalists before World War II. Once Japan is defeated, it will continue. And much surprising to many people, the communists under Mao Zedong are going to be victorious in 1949. Now, that's striking because the United States had supported the nationalists. We gave a lot of money and technology, tanks and things like that to the nationalists. But the communists believed much more in their cause. The nationalists by this time had become very corrupt. And so the higher communist morale, their belief in their cause, helped them defeat the U.S.-supported nationalists. The nationalists, though, will flee to Taiwan in 1949, and Taiwan will become a dictatorship, just an anti-communist dictatorship rather than a communist dictatorship, but will eventually become a wealthy liberal democracy. And this, by the way, is why there's trouble between China and Taiwan today, because Taiwan is technically a part of China. Both countries both governments, I should say, officially recognize that. So that's why it's hard to treat Taiwan as an independent country, because officially both recognize Taiwan as a part of China. Both governments claim to be the correct government of China. But one is a communist country, the other is a wealthy liberal democracy. So there's kind of a struggle. What strategies did the Chinese Communist government follow to try and bring economic development? So China, under the communists, did become independent, and it wanted to make a powerful independent state quickly, in part for security concerns. And so there's a saying, rich country, strong army. So if you want to make your country strong and secure, you need a powerful economy. So I had this question, how do we develop? Do we develop gradually based on technology, or we try and have rapid development based on the revolutionary fervor of the masses? Mao Zedong, the leader of the communists who had defeated the nationalists, said, look, the nationalists had the technology and it didn't help them. The reason we won the war was because we believed in our cause. The reason we won the war was the revolutionary fervor of the masses. So we're going to follow that. We don't need to develop through technology so much. We need to focus on the power of the people. That's how we won the Civil War. That's how we'll develop. And once we develop, look how great our country will be. We'll have enough food to eat. We'll have toys to play with. Life will be great. We'll have peace, all brought to us by me, Mao Zedong. This attempt to develop the economy rapidly based on the revolutionary fervor of the masses fails. There are two failed attempts to do this, and they are called the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, right? So we had this question, what were the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, how successful were they? They failed. The Great Leap Forward was an attempt to use the revolutionary fervor of the masses to quickly develop the economy. So basically, to give you an example of this, they told farmers, hey farmers, stop farming. Instead of farming, you're going to make steel. You're going to build furnaces and you're going to melt down iron, including like your farm tools, and you're going to make that into steel. Won't that be great? And so what happened was farmers stopped farming, spent all their time making steel. So because they aren't farming, the amount of food goes way down. And because they're making steel, but they're farmers that don't have proper equipment, they make useless steel. And sometimes, like I said, they melt down useful things like their farming tools to make that steel. So they don't get food, they don't get steel, millions of people die, right? Because instead of farming, they were making steel that no one could use. So instead of being a great leap forward, Lots of people die, and China's economy actually constricts. Mao, instead of saying, there's Mao pictured there, instead of saying, I guess I was wrong, we should go back to that whole gradual development through technology thing, says, nope, the problem was we weren't being revolutionary enough. We need to change China's culture. That will fix everything. So he launches the Cultural Revolution, where he encourages young people to rebel. He says, your teachers, your professors, basically everyone other than me who's an authority has led China down the wrong way. You're the youth. You can build a new culture. Rebel against them in my name, but don't rebel against me. And this led to Chinese students doing things like taking their teachers and humiliating them publicly. Something like 1 million people died in the political unrest, and it almost led to civil war. Once again, this fails completely. Rather than helping China to develop a new culture that would lead to economic development, it didn't help at all. It just killed a bunch of people and messed things up. So we had these 2 failed attempts. What worked, no one asked us, but I'll just point out to kind of make the story end on a note that makes a little bit more sense. Because you may say, well, geez, if that happened, why is China so wealthy? Deng Xiaoping will come to power, and he will follow gradual development based on technology, and it works really, really well. So they should have just done that in the beginning. Otherwise, so many people would not have died. So that ends the review. Good luck on the exam.